At 67, I never thought love would find me again. I had buried that hope somewhere between my husband's funeral and my youngest daughter's wedding. I had made peace with my quiet life, my chamomile tea, my Saturday morning gospel music, and the sound of my own breathing in a house that used to be full of noise. But life has a way of surprising you when you have stopped asking it to. And what happened to me in the autumn of my 67th year was something so unexpected, so dangerous, and so breathtakingly beautiful, that even now, sitting here telling you this story, my hands still tremble a little when I think about it. My name is Dorothy Mae Washington. I was born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and I have lived in Atlanta, Georgia for the last 32 years. I raised 3 children in this city. I buried a husband here. I built a life here brick by brick, prayer by prayer. And when my children grew up and moved into their own lives, I settled into the kind of quiet that older women like me learn to call contentment, even when it is really just loneliness wearing a respectable dress. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If you are new here and this is your first time watching a video on this channel, please take just 2 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button below. And tap that bell so you never miss a story. This is Afro-Korean Love Tales, and we tell stories here that will move your heart, shift your spirit, and remind you that love does not check your age before it knocks on your door. Now let me get back to my story. My days before all of this happened had a comfortable rhythm. I would wake up at 6 in the morning, even though I had nowhere to be. Old habits from decades of early shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse for 31 years. I would make my coffee, sit at my kitchen table, read my Bible, and watch the birds at the feeder outside my window. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at my church's food pantry. On Sundays, I sang in the senior choir. I video called my daughter Renee in Houston every Friday evening, and my son Marcus in Charlotte every other Sunday. My granddaughter Imani, who is 12 and already too smart for this world, would sometimes call me just to talk, and those calls were the brightest parts of my week. I was not unhappy. I want to make that clear. But there was a stillness in my house that sometimes felt less like peace and more like waiting. Waiting for something I could not name. Something I had long since stopped believing would ever come. The autumn that changed everything arrived the way Atlanta autumns do, quietly and warm at first. And then one evening the temperature drops and the rain comes and you realize summer is finally gone. It was a Tuesday in October. I remember because I had just come home from the food pantry and I was tired in that deep bone way that only comes when you are past 60 and you have been on your feet for hours. I had heated up some leftover soup, eaten it standing at the counter because I did not feel like sitting at that big empty table alone, and I was just about to turn off the porch light and go to bed early when I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow and deliberate. Not the knock of someone who was unsure. The knock of someone who had made a decision. I almost did not answer. It was nearly 9 o'clock at night and the rain had started, that heavy October rain that turns the streets glossy and dark. I looked through the peephole and what I saw made me pause. A man. Tall. Broad in the shoulders. Korean, I could see that clearly even through the small distorted circle of the peephole. He was wearing a dark suit that was soaked through, his black hair flat against his forehead from the rain. He was not looking at the door. He was looking down. And when I followed the direction of his gaze, I saw why. There was a child beside him. A little boy. Small and slight, maybe 5 or 6 years old, holding onto 2 fingers of the man's right hand with both of his tiny fists. The boy was soaked too. And he was looking directly at the peephole, as if he could see me standing on the other side of it. As if he knew I was there. Now I know what you are thinking. Dorothy, you are a woman living alone. You do not open your door at 9 o'clock at night to a stranger. And normally you would be absolutely right. I had lived alone for 9 years by that point and I had never once opened my door after dark to someone I did not know. But there was something about that little boy's face that I could not turn away from. Something in those serious dark eyes that reached right through the door and took hold of something inside me. I opened the door. The man looked up when he heard the latch. Up close he was even more striking. Sharp features, strong jaw, dark eyes that were guarded and careful but not unkind. He looked like a man who had learned a long time ago to keep his face very still. He was perhaps in his mid-40s, though something about the weight he carried made him seem older. He said, "Excuse me, ma'am. I apologize for disturbing you. My car stopped working just down the street. My phone has no battery. I saw your light." He paused and looked down at the boy. I only need to use a phone. Just for one call. His English was careful and precise, with a slight accent underneath it, and he spoke quietly, like a man who was used to not raising his voice to get people to listen. I looked at the little boy again. The child was shivering. Rainwater was dripping from the hem of his small jacket. He looked up at me with those enormous dark eyes and said nothing, but his bottom lip was trembling slightly, not from crying, just from cold. I stepped back and opened the door wider. I said, "Come in out of the rain. If you are watching this right now and you are somewhere warm and dry, I want you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Are you in the United States? Canada? The UK? Somewhere else in the world? Drop your location in the comments right now. I love knowing where my Afro-Korean Love Tales family is watching from. Means so much to me." The man stepped inside carefully, like someone who was aware of taking up space. The little boy came in beside him, still holding those two fingers. I closed the door against the rain and the October cold, and I looked at the two of them standing in my hallway, dripping on my hardwood floor, and something shifted in my chest. Something quiet and warm, like an ember catching. I told the man my name was Dorothy and I handed him my phone. He nodded once and said his name was J1. Park J1. He dialed a number from memory, held the phone to his ear, waited, then his jaw tightened slightly and he dialed again. Same result. He handed the phone back to me and said, "Thank you. I am sorry. No one is answering." I looked at the boy again. The child had not moved from J1's side, but he was looking around my hallway with quiet curiosity. His eyes landed on the framed photograph of my granddaughter Imani on the wall, and for just a moment, the serious little face softened. I said, "What is his name?" J1 looked down at the boy. He said, "His name is Minjun. He is my son." Minjun looked up at me, then properly looked at me, and in a small clear voice he said, "Your house smells like my grandmother's house." I do not know why that broke something open in me. Maybe because it was so honest. Maybe because I had not been anyone's grandmother in the physical present tense sense of the word in a very long time. Maybe because the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so unafraid, reminded me that children see the world without the armor that the rest of us spend our whole lives building. I said, "Well then you are welcome in it." And I went to the kitchen to get them both something warm. I heated up the rest of my soup. I made hot cocoa for Minjun with the little marshmallows I kept in the cabinet for when Imani visited. The boy sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the mug, and drank it with the kind of concentrated seriousness that small children bring to things they enjoy deeply. Jawan sat across from him, his large hands around a coffee mug, and watched his son with an expression that was so full of love and so full of something else, something heavier, something that looked almost like fear, that I had to look away. I busied myself at the counter and I asked the kinds of gentle questions that Southern women ask when they are trying to make strangers feel at home without prying. I asked how long he had been in Atlanta. He said almost 2 years. I asked if he had family here. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Only Minjun." I did not ask about the boy's mother. Something in the way he said only Minjun told me that was a door I should not open yet. After about 20 minutes his phone, which I had put on my charger, came back to life enough for him to make a call. He spoke in Korean quietly, turned slightly away from the table. His voice was low and controlled, but I could hear something clipped and urgent underneath it. When he hung up he turned back and said someone was coming to help with the car. They would be there in 30 minutes. Minjun had finished his cocoa and was now looking at me with those steady dark eyes. He said, "Do you live here by yourself?" I said, "Yes, I do." He considered this for a moment with the gravity of a small professor. Then he said, "Are you lonely?" Jaewon said Minjun sharply but quietly. The boy looked at his father and then back at me, unapologetic but obedient. I looked at that child and I felt the truth of my answer sitting in my chest like a stone. I smiled at him and I said, "Sometimes, but I have learned to be okay with it." Minjun nodded slowly, as if this was information he was filing away carefully. Then he said, "My dad is lonely too. But he does not say it." The silence that followed that statement was the loudest silence I had sat in for years. Jaewon did not look at me. He looked at his son with an expression I cannot fully describe, something between exasperation and raw tenderness. And in that moment, in my small warm kitchen with the rain hitting the windows and the smell of soup and cocoa in the air, I felt something I had not felt in 9 years. I felt seen. The man who came to fix the car arrived exactly when Jaewon said he would. 28 minutes after that phone call, there was a quiet knock at my door. 2 short and 1 long, like a code, and Jaewon stood up immediately, his whole body shifting into something more alert, more guarded. He thanked me with a sincerity that felt earned rather than polite. He helped Minjun into his jacket, which I had draped over the back of a chair near the heating vent to dry. The boy submitted to this with the patient stillness of a child, who was used to moving quickly when his father said it was time. At the door, Minjun turned and looked up at me one more time. He said, "Thank you for the cocoa with the little marshmallows." Then after a pause he said, "I hope you are not lonely tonight." I stood in my doorway and watched them walk down my porch steps into the rain, where a broad-shouldered young Korean man in a black jacket was waiting near the curb. Jaewon spoke to him briefly and quietly, and there was something in the way the younger man stood, attentive and still, that reminded me less of a mechanic and more of a soldier. I noticed that he had not arrived in a tow truck. He had arrived in a sleek black car with tinted windows, and there was another man sitting in the driver's seat who did not get out. I told myself it was nothing. People have drivers. People travel in nice cars. It was none of my business. I closed my door, turned off the porch light, and went to wash the mugs. But as I stood at the sink with my hands in the warm soapy water, I realized that my quiet house felt different than it had 2 hours ago. Not louder, just less empty somehow, like something had shifted in the air and had not shifted back. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about those dark eyes. Both pairs of them. 3 days passed. I went back to my routines. Food pantry on Thursday. Phone call with Renee on Friday. I did not tell anyone about the man and the boy in the rain because there was nothing to tell, really. A stranger used my phone. I gave a child hot cocoa. That was all. But on Saturday morning I found something on my porch. I opened my front door to bring in my mail, and there it was, sitting on the welcome mat. A small paper bag, the kind from a bakery, folded neatly at the top. Inside were 2 pieces of tteok Korean rice cake, dusted with a fine red bean powder and wrapped carefully in parchment paper. There was no note, no name, just the tteok still faintly warm, as if it had not been there long. I stood on my porch in my housecoat and slippers and looked up and down the street. There was no one. Just the early morning quiet of a Saturday in October, leaves skittering across the pavement, a neighbor's sprinkler running 2 houses down. I took the bag inside and sat at my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then I ate 1 piece of the tteok. It was soft and subtly sweet and tasted like something made with care. I saved the second piece and I sat there wondering what kind of man, after being helped by a stranger, shows up at dawn with homemade rice cake and leaves without knocking. The kind of man who is not sure he should knock, I thought. The kind of man who wants to say thank you but does not want to impose. Or the kind of man who wants an excuse to come back but is not ready to use it yet. I told myself I was being a silly old woman reading too much into pastry, but I smiled all morning. Now if this story is already pulling at your heart, I need you to do something for me right now. Please hit that like button. It lets YouTube know that this story deserves to be seen, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe to Afro Korean Love Tales right now and tap that bell. We have so many more stories coming, and you do not want to miss a single one. He came back the following Tuesday. Not at night this time. It was just past 11 in the morning and I was in my garden, such as it was, a narrow strip of earth along the side of my house where I grew collard greens in the summer and kept a few hardy chrysanthemums going into the fall. I was crouched down pulling up the last of the dead summer growth when I heard the gate at the side of the house open. I stood up quickly, my knees protesting the way they always do these days, and there was Jaewon standing at the entrance of my garden with Minjun beside him. Both of them were in casual clothes this time. Dark jeans, simple jackets. Minjun was wearing a bright yellow knit hat that seemed too cheerful for his serious little face, and it made my heart do something complicated. One said, "I am sorry to come without calling. I do not have your number. I only know your address." I said, "You left the rice cake." He nodded once. He said, "I wanted to thank you properly, but I did not want to wake you." I looked at him standing there in my garden with the autumn light on his face and I thought, this man has manners that were taught to him by someone who loved him. That kind of courtesy does not come from nowhere. I said, "Would you like some coffee?" Minjun said, "Can I see your garden?" And just like that, the three of us fell into a Tuesday morning together as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Minjun walked the length of my small garden with his hands clasped behind his back like a tiny inspector, asking questions about every plant in a way that was so earnest and thorough that I found myself explaining the difference between chrysanthemums and marigolds with the same care I used to give to my grandchildren when they were small. Jaewon sat on the back steps with his coffee and watched his son and me with that quiet, careful expression of his. And occasionally he would translate a Korean word that Minjun used when his English ran out. We stayed outside for almost an hour. The sun was warm for October and the chrysanthemums were still holding on, orange and gold and stubborn. And at some point Minjun decided that he wanted to help me, and I gave him a small trowel and let him dig at the edge of the bed while I turned the soil nearby. He was meticulous about it, focused in the way that some children are when they feel trusted with something real. At one point Jaewon came and crouched beside his son and said something softly in Korean. Minjun responded without looking up from his digging, and whatever the boy said made Jaewon go very still for a moment. Then Jaewon looked up at me and said, "He says this feels like home." I did not know what to say to that. So I just nodded and kept turning the soil and pretended that my eyes were watering from the cold. Before they left, Jaewon paused at the garden gate and asked if he could bring Minjun back sometime. He said the boy had been asking about the garden since Tuesday night. He said it quietly and without pressure, the way a man asks for something when he is prepared to be told no. I said, "You are both welcome here anytime." He nodded. And then he said, "You are a very kind woman, Dorothy," in a careful, measured way. But something in his voice when he said my name, the way he paused just slightly before it, like it was something he had been thinking about saying and had finally decided to, made the back of my neck feel warm. I went inside and stood in my kitchen and pressed both hands flat on the cool counter and talked some sense into myself. He is 40-something years old and you are 67, Dorothy. He is Korean and you are a black woman from Memphis. He has a child and a past you know nothing about, and men in black cars who come when he calls and do not get out of the vehicle. You are a retired nurse with chrysanthemums and a senior choir and a granddaughter named Imani. This is not your story. But even as I said it to myself, I knew I did not fully believe it. Because the truth is, when you reach my age and you have spent enough years being the strong one, the steady one, the one who keeps everything together for everyone else, and then someone looks at you the way Jaewon looked at me in that garden, like you are something worth being careful with, something in you rises up to meet it whether you give it permission or not. They came back the following Saturday. And the one after that. And somewhere in the rhythm of those visits, in the cocoa and the garden and Minjun's running commentary on everything he observed, in the way Jaewon began to relax by degrees the way a man does when he is somewhere he has decided to trust, something between us began to quietly grow. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way things grow in autumn, slow and gold and against all reasonable expectation. But there was something else growing too. Something I was not paying enough attention to. I noticed it first about a month after that rainy Tuesday night. I was coming home from the grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon, pulling into my driveway with 2 bags of groceries on the back seat, and I saw a car parked across the street that I did not recognize. Dark sedan, tinted windows, engine running. I might not have thought anything of it, except that it was still there when I came back out to get the second bag. And when I glanced over, I had the distinct feeling that someone inside was watching my house. I told myself I was imagining things. City paranoia. I had lived in Atlanta long enough to know that not every unfamiliar car on the street meant something sinister. But 2 days later I found an envelope on my porch. Not a bakery bag this time. A plain white envelope with no name on it, sealed, sitting on my welcome mat the same way the tiak had been. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It was not empty. There was something inside, something flat and rectangular like a card. I stood on my porch for a long moment, that envelope in my hand, with a feeling I had not felt since my nursing days when something about a patient's chart told me before the test results came back that something was seriously wrong. That instinct that lives below the mind. That quiet alarm that does not announce itself loudly, but simply settles into your bones and stays there. I took the envelope inside. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I opened it. Inside the envelope was a single card. No words. No message. Just a photograph printed on plain paper, the kind you print at home in a hurry. It was a photograph of my front porch, taken from across the street from the angle of that dark sedan I had noticed 2 days before. And in the photograph, visible through my front window, was the silhouette of two people sitting at my kitchen table. J1 and me. Taken during one of his visits without either of us knowing. I sat very still for a long time after I saw that photograph. Then I picked up my phone and called J1. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had found. There was a silence on his end that lasted just long enough to tell me that he was not surprised. Not fully. He asked me in a very calm voice if my doors were locked. I said yes. He said he would come over. I said, J1, tell me what is going on. Another silence. And then he said, I will explain everything when I get there. Please do not open the door for anyone until I arrive. He was at my house in 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time. He came alone without Minjun, which told me something about the seriousness of what he was about to say. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where his son had drunk hot cocoa with marshmallows 2 months ago, and he folded his hands in front of him and looked at me with those dark, careful eyes, and he told me the truth. His full name was Park Jae-won. He was 44 years old. He had been born in Seoul, South Korea, and he had come to the United States 11 years ago. For most of his adult life, from the age of 19 until 3 years ago, he had been a high-ranking member of one of Seoul's most powerful criminal organizations. Not a foot soldier. Not an errand runner. He had been what they called an underboss, the man beneath the man at the top, the one who kept order, who enforced loyalty, who made the decisions that the man at the top did not want his hands on directly. He said all of this quietly and without flinching, the way a man speaks when he has decided that the truth is the only thing he has left to offer. 3 years ago he said he had tried to leave. He had a reason to leave by then. Minjun had just turned 3. And Jae-won had looked at his son one morning and understood with a clarity that hit him like cold water that he could not raise that child in the life he was living. Minjun's mother had died 18 months earlier, a fact Jae-won told me in a single flat sentence that contained an entire ocean of grief he was not ready to cross in front of me yet. And Jae-won had looked at his little boy and decided that whatever it cost him, he was going to become someone that child could be proud of. Leaving an organization like the one he had belonged to was not as simple as handing in a resignation. There were people who viewed his knowledge, his connections, his history as assets that belonged to them. There were people who had decided that a man who knew what Jae-won knew was either useful or dangerous, and that the moment he stopped being useful he became the latter. He had negotiated his exit over the course of a year, calling in every favor he had ever accumulated, leveraging every piece of information he had ever stored. He had brought Minjun to the United States and he had spent the last 2 years building a legitimate business, a Korean restaurant group with 2 locations in Atlanta, and staying as far below the surface as a man with his history could manage. But someone had found him. He did not know yet if it was someone from his past in Seoul reaching across the ocean, or someone here in Atlanta with old connections and long memories. What he knew was that for the past 3 weeks, he had been aware of being watched. He had not told me because he had not wanted to frighten me. He had not stopped coming because he said, and here he paused and looked at his hands for a moment, because being in my home was the first time in 3 years that he had felt something close to peace. And he had been selfish enough to hold on to that longer than he should have. I sat across from him and I listened to all of it without interrupting. That was my nurse's training. You let people finish. You do not react before you have the full picture. When he was done I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, where is Minjun right now? He said, with my restaurant manager. A woman I trust completely. He is safe. I said, are you in danger right now tonight? He said, I do not believe so. I believe this is a warning. Someone letting me know they know where I am. Reminding me that I am not as invisible as I thought. I said, what do you need to do? He looked at me then, really looked at me, with something in his expression that I do not have a precise word for. Something between gratitude and bewilderment, like he could not quite understand why I was asking what he needed instead of asking him to leave. I want to stop here for just a moment and speak directly to you, because I know some of you are feeling exactly what I felt in that moment. That pull between what is safe and what is real. That question of whether love, or even the beginning of love, is worth the weight that sometimes comes with it. I want to know what you are thinking right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have asked him to leave? Or would you have stayed in that kitchen with him? I genuinely want to know. And while you are down there, please make sure you have subscribed to Afro Korean Love Tales and hit that bell. Every subscription truly helps this channel and means the world to me personally. Now let me tell you what happened next. Jaewon made some calls that night. Quiet calls in Korean, from my back porch while I made tea and tried to keep my hands steady. I could not understand the words, but I understood the tenor of them. These were not panicked calls. They were strategic ones. The voice of a man who had spent 20 years in dangerous rooms and knew how to navigate them. By the time he came back inside, something in his posture had settled. He sat back down at my table and he told me that he had reached out to someone he trusted, a former associate who had also left the organization and who had connections on both sides of the law. That man was going to find out who had sent the photograph and what they wanted. In the meantime, Jaewon said, he thought it would be safer if he did not come to my house for a while. He said it carefully, watching my face as he said it, like he was bracing for something. I said, and Minjun? He said Minjun had been asking about me every day. He said the boy had drawn a picture of my garden at school and told his teacher it belonged to his friend Dorothy. I pressed my lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment because I was not going to cry in front of this man over a child's drawing. I was not. I said, you tell Minjun that Miss Dorothy's chrysanthemums are still holding on and she is saving the last of them for him to see. Jaewon looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, you are a remarkable woman. I said, I am a 67-year-old retired nurse from Memphis who grows collard greens and sings in the senior choir. There is nothing remarkable about me. He said, you opened your door to a stranger in the rain. You fed his child. You listened to his truth without flinching. You asked what he needed instead of telling him to leave. He paused. Where I come from, Dorothy, that kind of courage has a name. I asked him what name. He said, in Korean we say ri. Where? It means loyalty, faithfulness, the kind that does not ask what it gets in return. I had never heard that word before that night. But from the way he said it, soft and serious like it was something sacred, I felt it settle into me like a word I had always known and simply had not been given yet. He left just after 10 o'clock. I walked him to the door and we stood for a moment in the doorway with the night air between us, cool and quiet, the street empty in both directions. He looked at me and I looked at him and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then he reached out and very gently, very briefly, touched the back of my hand with 2 fingers. The same 2 fingers his son always held. Then he said goodnight and walked to his car and I closed the door and stood in my hallway with my back against the wood, and my heart doing things it had not done in nearly a decade. The following 2 weeks were the longest 2 weeks I had experienced in years. I went about my routines. Food pantry. Senior choir. Friday call with Renee, during which I said nothing because I did not know how to begin. I watered my chrysanthemums and thought about Wire and watched the street from my window more than I wanted to admit. On the 9th day, I found a small folded note in my mailbox. Not an envelope this time. Just a piece of paper folded twice, with my name written on the outside in careful, precise handwriting. Inside it said, in English, the chrysanthemums at Centennial Park are still blooming. Minjun would like to see them. Saturday at 10 if you are willing. I read that note 4 times standing at my mailbox in the morning cold. Then I folded it back up and put it in the pocket of my housecoat and went inside and stood at my kitchen window and looked at my own chrysanthemums, orange and gold and stubborn against the November chill. And I said out loud to no one in particular, oh Dorothy, you are in so much trouble. But I was smiling when I said it. Saturday came and I was at Centennial Park at 5 minutes to 10 in a burgundy wool coat I had not worn in 2 years and my good walking shoes. I told myself I was going for the flowers. I told myself I was going for Minjun. I told myself all kinds of sensible things on the drive over. And then I saw the 2 of them waiting by the park entrance, Minjun in his yellow hat, bouncing slightly on his heels the way small children do when they are trying very hard to contain excitement, and Jaewon standing beside him with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes already on me from across the parking lot, and every sensible thing I had told myself on the drive over quietly packed its bags and left. Minjun saw me at the same moment I saw him and he broke away from his father's side and came running across the path toward me with his arms out, and I crouched down to meet him even though my knees complained loudly about the decision, and he ran straight into my arms and held on with the fierce, uncomplicated grip that children reserve for people they have decided belong to them. I held that little boy in the middle of Centennial Park on a cold November morning and I thought, whatever else happens, whatever danger lives at the edges of this story, This moment right here is real and it is good and I am not going to apologize for it. Jaewon reached us and looked down at his son still wrapped around my neck, and then looked at me with that expression I was coming to know. The one where the careful guarded surface of him softened just enough to show the man underneath. He said, I told him not to run. Minjun pulled back and looked at his father with absolute serenity and said, but I wanted to run. I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and surprises you. And Jaewon smiled. Not the small polite almost smile I had seen before. A real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole face. And I understood in that moment why he kept it so carefully stored away. A smile like that on a face like his was a dangerous thing. We walked through the park for almost 2 hours. Minjun held my hand on one side and his father's on the other, and he talked nearly the entire time about his school, about a book he was reading about dinosaurs, about a boy in his class named Tyler who had said something unkind and how Minjun had responded by simply not speaking to Tyler for a week, which he described as the most effective strategy. Jaewon and I walked and listened and occasionally exchanged glances over the top of Minjun's yellow hat. Glances that said things we were not yet saying out loud. The chrysanthemums were indeed still blooming, late and determined along the park's south path, white and purple and deep burgundy. Minjun stood in front of them with his hands clasped behind his back in that inspector pose of his, and studied them seriously, and then announced that Miss Dorothy's chrysanthemums were better. I said that was because Miss Dorothy talked to hers. Minjun considered this and said that perhaps the park should hire someone to talk to theirs. Jaewon said, in Korean we say, 꽃도 사랑을 먹고 자란다. Flowers grow on love too. Minjun nodded as if this confirmed his theory entirely. We stopped at a bench near the fountain and sat, Minjun between us, and for a few minutes none of us said anything, and it was the most comfortable silence I could remember sitting in. The kind of silence that does not need to be filled because the people in it are enough. Jaewon spoke first. He said, my contact found out who sent the photograph. I looked at him over Minjun's head. He glanced down at his son, who had pulled a small dinosaur figurine from his jacket pocket and was walking it along his knee with great concentration, apparently temporarily removed from our conversation. Jaewon said quietly, it was not someone from Seoul. It was a man here in Atlanta. A Korean-American businessman with old connections to the organization I left. A man who has been building his own operation here for the past several years, and who sees my restaurant business as competition. Not criminal competition. Legitimate competition. But he is using old methods to send messages. I said, what kind of messages? He said, the kind that say, I know where you are. I know who you spend your time with. Do not make yourself comfortable. The way he said who you spend your time with landed on me with a weight I felt in my chest. I looked at my hands in my lap. I said, he knows about me. Jaewon said, yes. I am sorry, Dorothy. I should have been more careful. I should have stayed away sooner. I said, and yet you sent a note to my mailbox. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. And I am not sorry for that. Minjun's dinosaur stopped walking along his knee. The boy looked up at his father, then at me with those ancient serious eyes, and I had the distinct feeling that he had not been as absorbed in his dinosaur as he had appeared. I want to pause here and ask you something, those of you who are watching this right now. Have you ever been in a situation where the sensible choice and the true choice were not the same thing? Where everything around you said walk away but everything inside you said stay? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you have been on this journey with me from the beginning of this video, please take a moment right now to share this video with one person you think would love this story. Sharing is the greatest gift you can give to a small channel like Afro Korean Love Tales, and it costs you nothing but a few seconds. Things shifted after that Saturday in the park. Something between Jaewon and me that had been moving slowly and carefully began to move with a little more certainty, the way a river moves when the channel finally opens wide enough to let it through. He began calling me in the evenings, short calls at first, practical things, asking how I was, telling me about Minjun's day, but gradually the calls grew longer and less practical and more honest, and I found myself sitting in my chair by the window in the dark long after I would normally have gone to bed, talking to this man about things I had not talked about to anyone in years. I told him about my husband Gerald, who had died of a heart attack 9 years ago at the age of 63, suddenly and without warning, on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I told him how I had not cried at the funeral because I was too busy making sure everyone else was all right, and how I had cried for the first time 6 weeks later, alone in my car in the hospital parking lot before a shift, and once I started I could not stop for nearly an hour. I told him that I still set 2 coffee cups out every morning sometimes by reflex before I remembered. He told me about Minjun's mother, whose name was Soo-yeon, a woman he had loved deeply and imperfectly, a woman who had known exactly what kind of world he moved in and had loved him anyway and had asked only one thing of him in the end, to get their son out of it. He told me that the guilt of not having left sooner, of having cost Soo-yeon years of fear that she should not have had to carry, was something he carried every day. He said he did not expect to be forgiven for it. He expected only to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve the son she had left him with. I listened to all of it and I said, Jae-won, grief is not a debt. You cannot pay it off. You can only carry it with enough grace that it does not crush you. He was quiet for a long time after that and then he said, how did you learn that? I said, the hard way. Same as everyone. December arrived and with it the particular ache that the holiday season brings to people who are doing it alone. My daughter Renee was coming for Christmas with her family, which I was grateful for. But in the weeks before, the house felt especially quiet. Jae-won and Minjun had become a regular presence in my life by then. Saturday park walks, occasional Tuesday morning garden visits, even as the cold deepened, evening phone calls. Minjun had taken to drawing pictures for me that Jae-won would bring, careful detailed drawings of my garden, of the park fountain, of what appeared to be my kitchen table with 3 figures sitting at it, one tall and dark-haired, one small with a yellow hat, and one with what Minjun described very seriously as beautiful brown skin and kind eyes. I had taped that drawing to my refrigerator next to Imani's school photo. When Renee came for Christmas and saw it, she stood in my kitchen for a long moment and then turned and looked at me with her mother's eyes that missed nothing and said, Mama, who drew this? I said, a friend's child. She looked at the drawing again and then back at me and said, Mama, are you seeing someone? I said, I am 67 years old, Renee, I am not seeing anyone. She said, that is not what I asked. I changed the subject and Renee, who knows me well enough to know when to let something sit, allowed it. But she kept looking at the drawing all through Christmas dinner with a small careful smile that reminded me of her father. It was 2 days after Christmas, the 27th of December, when everything came apart. I was at Jae-won's restaurant. He had invited me for dinner, a first, and I had sat at a corner table near the kitchen and eaten the most extraordinary Korean food I had ever tasted in my life while Minjun, who apparently came to the restaurant often enough to have claimed a corner of the back office as his personal territory, visited my table 3 times to give me updates on the progress of his dinosaur novel, which he had decided to write and illustrate himself. The restaurant was warm and full and beautifully lit, all dark wood and soft gold light, and Jae-won came and sat with me between the dinner service and the late crowd, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and we talked easily and well the way 2 people talk when they have stopped performing comfort and are simply in it. And I looked at him across that table, this complicated, careful, quietly beautiful man, and I thought with a clarity that sometimes only comes to you late in life, when you have stopped having the luxury of pretending, I love this man. Not the beginning of it. Not the possibility of it. The real thing, settled and certain, the kind that does not ask permission. I did not say it. But I thought it. And the thought sat in me like a warm stone. And then the front window of the restaurant exploded inward. The sound was enormous, a crack and a shatter that silenced everything in the room instantly, and in the half-second before anyone moved I saw Jae-won's face go completely still in a way I had not seen before. Not afraid, something beyond afraid, something operational and cold. He was on his feet before the glass stopped falling, moving toward me, reaching for my arm, his voice low and absolutely steady saying, Dorothy, stand up. Come with me now, do not stop. And above everything else, above the screaming that had started near the window, above the sound of chairs scraping and people moving, above all of it, was one thought that rose in me like a shout. Minjun was in the back office. I do not know what I looked like in that moment, but I know what I felt. Every instinct I had, 31 years of nursing instinct, mother instinct, grandmother instinct, the deep animal instinct that does not consult your mind before it moves, all of it turned in one direction. Toward that little boy in the back office with his dinosaur novel and his yellow hat. I pulled my arm from Jae-won's grip. He looked at me with sharp, urgent eyes and said, Dorothy, we need to go out the back. I said, Minjun. He said, my manager is with him, he is safe. I said, Jae-won, I am not leaving this building without that child and neither are you. Go. He looked at me for one full second. Then he moved. We went through the kitchen, Jae-won ahead of me, his hand back on my arm now, not pulling but guiding, steady and sure. The kitchen staff were pressed against the far wall. A young man near the stove was on his phone. Someone was crying. Jaewon said something sharp and brief in Korean as we passed through, and two of the men straightened and fell in behind us. The back office was a small room off the rear corridor, and when Jaewon pushed the door open, Minjun was standing in the center of it with his manager, a sturdy Korean woman named Ms. Cho, who had placed herself between the boy and the door with the calm, deliberate stance of someone who had decided what she was willing to do and had made her peace with it. Minjun was not crying. He was standing very straight with his dinosaur figurine held tightly in both hands, and his face was doing that thing it did, that extraordinary stillness, except that his eyes when they found his father were enormous with something he was working very hard not to let become panic. Jaewon crossed the room in 3 strides and picked his son up and held him, one large hand cradling the back of Minjun's head, and the boy pressed his face into his father's shoulder and made one small sound, just one. That was the most heartbreaking thing I had heard in years. Ms. Cho looked at me and I looked at her, and we understood each other completely without a single word. Jaewon was already on his phone, one arm still holding Minjun, speaking in rapid Korean, his voice controlled but moving fast. Within 4 minutes, and I know because I was counting, 2 men appeared at the back door of the restaurant. Not police. Jaewon's people. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. And within another 3 minutes we were in a vehicle moving away from the restaurant through the back streets of Atlanta. I sat in the back seat with Minjun between me and Jaewon. The boy had not spoken since that one small sound in the office. He was pressed against my side with my arm around him and his dinosaur still in his fist, and he was very still and very quiet, and I kept my voice low and even and said things like, "You are safe, I have got you, everything is all right," the same words I used to say to frighten patients in the middle of the night. The words that are not really about their content but about the steadiness of the voice that carries them. At some point Minjun turned his face up to me and said, "Were you scared?" I said, "A little." "Were you?" He said, "Yes. But I knew Appa would come. He always comes." I looked over the top of his head at Jaewon, who was watching his son with an expression of such raw and unguarded love that I had to look away again because it felt too intimate to witness directly. They took us to a residence I had not been to before. A clean, quiet house in a suburb north of the city that belonged to one of Jaewon's trusted associates. Ms. Cho arrived 20 minutes later. A doctor came and checked Minjun over, a routine precaution, and pronounced him perfectly fine physically, which we already knew, but it mattered to have it said out loud. The man responsible for the attack on the restaurant was identified by midnight. Jaewon's contact, the former associate he had called weeks earlier, had been quietly building a picture for weeks, and the window had provided the final confirmation needed. The man's name was not one I would remember or repeat, but what mattered was this. By the following morning, through channels I did not fully understand and did not ask too many questions about, the situation had been resolved. Not with violence. Jaewon was clear about that, and I believed him. Resolved through the kind of negotiated pressure that men with certain histories apply when they need something to stop. The message delivered was simple. Jaewon Park was not a threat to anyone's business. He was a restaurant owner and a father, and he wanted nothing from anyone except to be left alone to raise his son. And if that was not respected, what Jaewon knew, and there was a great deal that Jaewon knew, would become a significant problem for a significant number of people. It stopped. Not all at once, and not without a few more anxious weeks of watching and waiting. But it stopped. I want to be honest with you about something because this is a true life story, and true life stories are only worth telling if they are honest. In those weeks of waiting, I questioned myself more than once. I am a 67-year-old woman. I am a grandmother. I sing in the senior choir and I grow collard greens and I volunteer at my church's food pantry. I had built a quiet, respectable, peaceful life, and I had walked, with my eyes open and my good sense fully intact, directly into something that shattered every window of that quiet life and forced me to stand in a restaurant kitchen while my heart was in a back office with a 5-year-old boy and a dinosaur figurine. And I would do it again. Every time. Without hesitation. Because here is what I learned, and this is the part one need you to hear if you hear nothing else from this story today. Love does not arrive on a schedule. It does not check your age or your circumstances or your carefully arranged routines before it decides to show up. It does not ask whether you are ready, or whether the timing is convenient, or whether the person it has brought to your door comes from the same world you were raised in. Simply arrives. And what you do when it arrives, whether you open the door or leave the porch light off, that is the only question that matters. I opened the door. And everything that came through it, the danger and the fear and the uncertainty and the sleepless nights, all of it came with something else too. It came with a little boy who drew my kitchen table with 3 figures sitting at it and called my house the place that smells like his grandmother's house. It came with a man who left rice cake on my welcome mat at dawn because he was not yet sure he had the right to knock. It came with the word "were" loyalty, the kind that does not ask what it gets in return, settling into me like a word I had always known. If you are somewhere in the later chapters of your life right now, if you have told yourself that your story is mostly written, that the significant things have already happened and what remains is just the quiet tending of what is already there, I want to speak to you directly. Your story is not finished. Promise you that. The door can still knock. The rain can still bring someone to your porch. And you are allowed, at 67 or 73 or 81, to open that door and see what is standing on the other side of it. It has now been 14 months since that rainy Tuesday in October when a Korean stranger and his little boy stood on my porch and changed my life. Jaewon's restaurants are doing well. Both locations. He opened a third one in the spring and Minjun attended the opening in a small tie that he wore with tremendous seriousness. I was there too, at a table near the kitchen, the same corner where I had sat on the night the window broke, and it felt like the right place to be. Minjun is in 1st grade now and reading well above his level, which surprises no one who has spent more than 20 minutes with him. He calls me Miss Dorothy still, but last month he asked his father if he could call me something else, something that meant more, and Jaewon told me about it on the phone that evening with a quietness in his voice that told me the question had moved him deeply. We have not settled on a word yet. But we are working on it, the 3 of us together. My daughter Renee knows everything now. I told her in February, all of it, from the rainy night to the restaurant window to the quiet resolution and everything in between. She was silent for a very long time on the phone and then she said, "Mama, are you happy?" I said yes. She said, "Is he good to you?" I said yes. She said, "Is he good to that little boy?" I said, "He is the best father I have ever seen outside of your own." Another long silence. And then she said, "Well then I want to meet him." And she did, at Easter. And she spent the entire dinner interrogating Jaewon with the focused intensity of a woman who loves her mother fiercely and intends to protect her. And Jaewon answered every question she asked with the same quiet honesty he had given me at my kitchen table on the night he told me his truth. And by the end of the evening my daughter was teaching Minjun how to make her grandmother's cornbread, and the sound of laughter in my kitchen was so loud and so full that I had to step out onto the back porch for a moment just to breathe it in properly. This is Afro-Korean Love Tales, and this has been my story. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you the most. Was it Minjun and the cocoa? The word "were"? The night the window broke? The Easter dinner? Tell me. I read every comment and I treasure every one of them. And if you are not yet part of our family here, please subscribe to Afro-Korean Love Tales right now and hit that bell so you never miss a story. We tell stories here about love that crosses borders and defies expectations, stories about courage and second chances, and the extraordinary things that happen when you decide it is not too late. Those stories need to be heard, and you deserve to hear them. Like this video if it blessed you today. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love has no expiration date. And come back, because there are so many more stories waiting for you right here. I am Dorothy Mae Washington, and at 67 years old, I learned that the most important thing you can do when life knocks on your door in the rain is simply this. Open it.